I was in the garage, fixing up an old toolbox, when I heard a sound I'll never forget: the sharp, dying beep of my pregnant wife's medical device shutting off. My stomach dropped. I ran outside, and there she was, HOA Karen, standing by the side of our house, smug as a cat, one hand gripping the main breaker lever she'd just pulled. Violates community aesthetics. She smirked, as if that justified cutting power to the machine, keeping my wife and unborn child safe. I yelled that she could have just killed them both. She rolled her eyes and walked away like it was nothing. 5 minutes later, the whole neighborhood shook as 2 Black Hawk helicopters roared overhead, blotting out the sun. The moment those rotors thumped in the distance, my mind was already 3 steps ahead. But to get here to the moment where Blackhawks were casting shadows over Karen's spray-tanned face, I have to take you back a bit. My name's Mark Delaney. I spent 20 years in the Army, most of it in a special operations unit. I've been dropped into places most folks wouldn't walk into on a dare, and I've seen more than my share of ugly. But after I retired, all I wanted was peace, a small home, a garden, and time with my wife, Sarah. She's the strongest person I know. But this pregnancy, it wasn't easy. Sarah was 8 months along, and complications meant she needed a medical monitor and a supplemental oxygen machine right in our bedroom. Without them, her heart rate and oxygen could dip to dangerous levels. Our doctor had been clear: if that equipment failed, even for a short time, it could be deadly for her and the baby. We bought a modest home in what looked like a nice, quiet neighborhood. It had tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and a friendly community sign at the entrance. What we didn't know was that behind that sign lurked the HOA and its queen bee, Karen Holt. She was the type who treated her title of HOA president like a royal crown. Mid-50s, bleached blonde bob, flashy jewelry, always marching around in wedge sandals like she was reviewing troops. From the day we moved in, she made it clear she didn't approve of us. First, it was the color of our front door. Then, the way I parked my truck. And the biggest offense. In her eyes, the small shed and backup generator I had installed to ensure Sarah's equipment never failed during a power outage. You know, she said one afternoon, marching up our driveway without so much as a hello, that big ugly thing out back is a violation of our aesthetic standards. I explained politely at first that it wasn't a big ugly thing. It was critical medical equipment. I even showed her the doctor's letter confirming its necessity. She barely glanced at it before saying, "Rules are rules, Mr. Delaney. You can't just clutter up the neighborhood with whatever this is." That was our first real clash. I thought maybe, with time, she'd drop it. I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, she sent formal warning letters, citing bylaws about unsightly structures and non-approved modifications. I responded each time with medical documentation and the fact that the Americans with Disabilities Act protected Sarah's right to this equipment. Karen didn't care. If anything, the more I pushed back, the more determined she became to make our lives miserable. I caught her peering over our fence more than once, snapping photos. Once, she even tried to lecture Sarah while she was resting on the porch, telling her that pregnancy isn't an excuse to break the rules. That day, I told Karen firmly to get off our property. She stormed off, muttering something about teaching us a lesson. The lesson came on a warm Friday afternoon. I was in the garage, organizing tools, when the beeping started, that urgent, high-pitched sound from Sarah's monitor. My heart leapt into my throat. I ran inside, found Sarah pale and gasping, the monitor screen black. The oxygen machine was off too. I sprinted outside, and there was Karen standing at the side of our house, hand still on the breaker. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. "Restoring neighborhood integrity," she said, with that smug smile that made my blood boil. "That thing is a violation, and I've warned you enough times. That thing is keeping my wife and unborn child alive," I roared. She shrugged. "Not my problem. Should have followed the rules." And with that, she walked off like she'd just watered her roses. I bolted back inside, got Sarah to the couch, and grabbed my phone. I dialed 911, gave them our address, and told them it was a medical emergency. Then I reached for something I hadn't touched in years, my old encrypted field radio. I didn't have time to explain everything over the airwaves. I just sent the code phrase my old unit used for life-threatening emergency, request immediate evac support. I hadn't used it since Afghanistan, but I knew if they got it, they'd come. As I knelt by Sarah, checking her pulse, I heard the faint hum. At first, I thought it was a truck far away, but it grew louder, deeper, rhythmic. I knew that sound in my bones. Karen was still on the sidewalk, chatting with a couple of other HOA board members, acting like she'd just saved the neighborhood. She didn't notice the way the air shifted, the way leaves trembled in the trees. I did, because I knew exactly what was coming. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. The hum turned into a pounding thump that rattled the windows. Out past the rooftops, I caught the glint of sunlight on spinning rotor blades. Karen was mid-sentence, probably telling her little HOA sidekicks how she'd finally handled the Delaney's, when the first Black Hawk crested the tree line. You've never seen a smug face melt faster. Her eyes went wide, and she actually stepped back like the thing might land on her. But here's the thing, I didn't call in a favor for intimidation. I called it because I needed Sarah safe. The only people I trusted more than the paramedics were the medics I'd served with. And apparently, my old unit took immediate evac literally, because 2 Blackhawks came in low, banking over the cul-de-sac like a scene out of a war movie. Neighbors came pouring out of their houses, hands shading their eyes, shouting over the roar. The HOA board members froze, their clipboards shaking in their hands. Karen tried to save face, yelling something about disturbing the peace, but her words were swallowed up by the chop of the blades. The lead chopper hovered right above the greenbelt behind our house, sending dust and loose leaves swirling. Out the side, a medic in full tactical gear waved to me. I waved back and pointed toward the door. Within seconds, 2 medics were on the ground, sprinting into my living room. The rest of the team spread out, some moving to secure the perimeter, others unloading a portable generator and oxygen tank. Inside, Sarah was pale, clutching her belly, but she managed a weak smile when she saw the medic's patch, a unit she knew had saved lives in far worse places. They got her reconnected to oxygen, the monitor beeping steady again. Outside, the crowd was thickening. Phones were out, recording everything. Karen's voice finally cut through the noise as she marched up toward one of the soldiers. "What is this?" she demanded. "You can't just land helicopters in a residential area. This is a clear violation of..." The soldier didn't flinch. "Ma'am, step back. We have an active medical emergency. You're interfering with federal personnel." "Federal?" Karen sputtered, like she'd just bitten into something sour. "This is HOA jurisdiction." That got a few chuckles from the neighbors. One of the soldiers, a tall guy named Morales I'd served with in Kandahar, gave me a side glance and murmured, "Still pulling rank on civilians." I didn't even need to answer, because Karen, in all her oblivious glory, started rattling off HOA bylaws like they were the U.S. Constitution. That's when Morales tapped his comms and said, "Copy. We've identified the hostile party. Standing by for instructions." Her head snapped toward him. "Hostile party. I am the president of this neighborhood." Morales didn't miss a beat. "Then you're the president of a crime scene." I could almost hear the collective gasp from the onlookers. The words crime scene tend to grab attention, especially when said by someone in combat gear. The HOA board members started inching away from her, like maybe if they moved slow enough, they wouldn't get lumped in with her. I stepped outside just as 2 uniformed local police cruisers rolled in. Turns out the 911 call had gone through after all, and they'd been told to coordinate with the incoming military medical response. The senior officer, a woman named Lieutenant Harris, came right up to me. "Mr. Delaney, can you confirm that this woman," she gestured to Karen, "cut the power to a medical device in your home?" Before I could answer, Karen blurted out, "Yes, but only because it was an eyesore, and he was warned, that was it." Harris turned to one of her officers. "Detain her for interfering with life-sustaining medical equipment. Possible ADA violation, reckless endangerment, and negligence." Karen's mouth dropped open. "You can't arrest me in front of my neighbors." "Oh, I think we can," Harris said. "Matter of fact." 2 officers stepped in, reading her rights as they cuffed her. The crowd went from murmuring to full-on whispering and gasping, phones tilted to capture every second. Karen tried to twist around to face me. "You're going to regret this." "Delaney." I stepped forward just enough for her to hear me over the blades still chopping the air above. "Karen, the only thing I regret is that you thought your rules were more important than my wife's life." Her face flushed red, whether from rage or embarrassment. I couldn't tell, but I did know this for the first time since we moved in. She wasn't in control of the situation. Behind me, Morales stepped onto the porch. "Sarah's stable," he said. "We're transferring her to the base hospital for observation." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my chest. Karen, still mouthing protests, was guided into the back of a police cruiser. The sound of the door slamming shut was almost as satisfying as the steady beep of Sarah's heart monitor. The neighborhood had gone dead quiet except for the helicopters, and in that silence, I realized this wasn't over, because Karen might be in cuffs now. But HOA politics have a way of getting ugly before they get better, and I was ready for round two. I wish I could tell you that Karen's arrest was the end of it, that after the cuffs and the police cruiser, she just faded into the background like a bad dream. But this was an HOA battle, and in an HOA battle, logic and decency are the first casualties. By that evening, while Sarah was being monitored at the base hospital, my phone started lighting up. Unknown numbers, voicemail after voicemail. When I finally checked one, it was a nasal voice reading off what sounded like a prepared statement. "This is the legal representative for the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. We demand the immediate release of our HOA president, Ms. Karen Holt, who has been unlawfully detained due to a misunderstanding regarding community bylaws. Failure to comply will result in legal action against you, Mr. Delaney, for slander, harassment, and defamation of character." I actually laughed out loud. They wanted me to comply like I was the one holding Karen hostage. But under the humor was a slow burn, because I knew what this really meant. The HOA wasn't just backing Karen, they were doubling down. The next morning, I woke up to find a folded paper shoved through my front door. It was a formal violation notice multiple pages long, listing supposed infractions ranging from unauthorized exterior modifications to non-compliance with scheduled lawn maintenance. At the bottom, it said I had 14 days to fix these issues or face daily fines. Sarah, still pale from the ordeal, sat at the kitchen table reading it with disbelief. "They're coming after us because you called for help," she said. "Because I embarrassed them," I corrected. "Karen's their queen bee. If she goes down, some of them go down with her." While she rested, I made calls first to Lieutenant Harris, then to an old friend in the State Attorney General's office. I wanted to know exactly how far I could push back without stepping into legal quicksand. The answer, farther than the HOA thought. That afternoon, I attended the emergency HOA board meeting they'd hastily scheduled at the community clubhouse. I walked in wearing my old Army service jacket. Not for show, but because it made a statement I wasn't going to be bullied. The room went quiet when I entered. The board sat at a long table up front, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact. In the middle seat was the acting president, a wiry man named Greg Mason, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "We're here to address recent events involving one of our board members," Greg began, clearly trying to sound neutral. "There has been some misunderstanding." Misunderstanding, I cut in. "She cut power to life-sustaining medical equipment." "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a felony." A murmur rippled through the small crowd of residents seated behind me. Some of them were nodding. Others were glaring, clearly loyal to Karen. One woman stood up, a petite blonde with a pearl necklace I recognized from Karen's porch gatherings. "Mark, you've blown this way out of proportion. Karen was only trying to enforce our standards. We can't let one person's situation dictate the rules for everyone." I turned to face her fully. "My situation is that my wife and unborn child could have died because your friend decided the view from her kitchen window mattered more than their lives." The room went dead silent. Greg cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Regardless, the HOA has decided to issue fines." I stepped closer to the table, planting my hands flat. "Greg, I want you to think very carefully before you finish that sentence. Because right now, there are military reports, police statements, and video evidence from half the neighborhood that show exactly what happened. And if you try to punish us for stopping a crime, you're not just going to lose in court, you're going to lose in the court of public opinion. And trust me, that court's verdict is loud and permanent. From the back, a deep voice spoke up. He's right. I turned and saw a man in his 70s, Mr. Crawford, a Vietnam vet who lived 2 doors down. I saw the whole thing. He said, Karen's been throwing her weight around for years, but this time she went too far. If you find this man, you're telling all of us that you don't care about our safety. A few more neighbors chimed in, some reluctantly, others with visible relief. It was like a crack in a dam once the first bit of truth slipped through. More followed. Greg looked trapped. He shuffled papers again, then finally said, The board will table any fines for now, pending further review. That was HOA speak for we'll back off before this blows up bigger. But I wasn't fooled. This was a temporary retreat, not a surrender. I knew they'd regroup, and I knew Karen sitting somewhere with her lawyer was plotting her comeback. As I left the clubhouse, one of the board members muttered under his breath, You think you've won, but we're not done. I smiled without slowing my stride. Neither am I. Back at home, I updated Sarah. She looked at me with tired eyes but managed a small grin. Feels like we're in a war. I kissed her forehead. That's because we are. But the difference is, I've been through wars before, and I've never lost one worth fighting. 2 days after the HOA's emergency meeting, Karen's face popped up on the local news. She was walking out of the police station with her lawyer, holding a folder in front of her like it could shield her from the cameras. The headline read, HOA President Charged in Medical Device Tampering Incident. I paused the TV and took a long sip of coffee. That was good, but I knew Karen wasn't the type to let a charge stick without a fight. That afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was from the HOA's attorney, filled with legal jargon about trespass by military forces, damage to common areas caused by rotor wash, and my personal favorite intentional humiliation of an HOA officer. I read it twice, then smiled. They had no idea what kind of hornet's nest they'd just kicked. You see, after I retired from the Army, I didn't just disappear into civilian life. I took a position with the Department of Defense as a liaison to state emergency management agencies. My job, to ensure compliance with federal disaster protocols, which included oversight of critical medical infrastructure. That meant 2 things. I was legally authorized to coordinate military medical response in civilian areas. Any attempt to interfere with that, like cutting power to life-sustaining equipment, was a direct violation of federal law, carrying penalties the HOA couldn't even begin to imagine. Up until now, I'd kept that part of my life quiet. No need to wave credentials around unless I had to, but the HOA had just made it personal. I decided it was time to make my move. The next HOA board meeting was already on the schedule for Thursday evening, and word around the neighborhood was that attendance would be standing room only. People smelled drama, and in a community like ours, that was better than free wine at a block party. When I walked into the clubhouse, every head turned. Karen wasn't there. She was advised by counsel to stay away, but her loyalists were front and center, glaring at me like I'd keyed their cars. Greg, the acting president, looked uncomfortable but tried to start the meeting as if everything was normal. First item on the agenda, review of ongoing disputes involving, that would be me, I said, stepping forward. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my federal ID wallet. The gold Department of Defense seal caught the overhead lights. For those of you who don't know, my name is Mark Delaney. I'm not just a retired Army Sergeant Major. I'm a federal liaison for emergency management, which means I answer directly to the Department of Defense when it comes to life safety incidents. A ripple went through the crowd. Cameras from cell phones zoomed in. That night, I continued, I exercised my lawful authority to request immediate military medical assistance for my wife, whose life was in danger because one of your own board members, your president, deliberately cut the power to a medical device. That wasn't a bylaw violation. That was a felony. And every second she left that breaker down, she was breaking federal law. A few gasps came from the back. Greg's face went pale. And just so we're clear, I said, holding up the envelope they'd sent me, this little packet you delivered to my mailbox. This is what we call retaliatory harassment under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Not only will it get thrown out of court, but it also opens the entire HOA, every member who voted to approve this action, to personal liability. Now there was a full-on murmur in the room. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided my gaze altogether. One man near the front, clearly a Karen loyalist, stood up. "You're threatening us." "No," I said calmly. "I'm educating you. There's a difference. The threat came when your president decided her personal aesthetic preferences mattered more than federal law and human life. My job, my sworn duty, is to make sure that never happens again." At that moment, the door at the back opened and Lieutenant Harris from the local PD stepped in. She caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. "By the way," I said, turning back to the crowd, "the police investigation is still ongoing, and thanks to witness statements, video evidence, and a full medical report, I have no doubt the charges will stick. When they do, any HOA member who tries to shield Karen from accountability will be viewed as complicit." Harris took a step forward, and just to be clear, that's not me talking as a neighbor. That's me talking as the officer in charge of this case. Dead silence. Finally, Greg cleared his throat. "Given this information, the board will reconsider its position." I nodded. "Good. Because the next time I have to call in a Black Hawk, it won't be to save my wife. It'll be to enforce a federal seizure of HOA records." That earned a few nervous laughs, but nobody doubted I meant it. As I walked out of the clubhouse, I caught snippets of conversation, people talking about how they'd never seen anyone stand up to Karen like that. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in that room knew it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the final battle. Karen wasn't the type to crawl away quietly, and something told me she was going to try one last desperate move before this was over. And when she did, I'd be ready. If there's one thing the Army taught me, it's that you don't wait for the enemy to regroup. You keep the pressure on until they can't get back up. Karen might have been grounded for now, but I knew she was somewhere with her lawyer, cooking up a counterattack. And with the HOA still stacked with her loyalists, I had to move first. Step 1, hit them where it hurts their money. See, most HOA boards run on dues from residents, and ours was no exception. But here's what most people don't realize when an HOA is accused of violating the Americans with Disabilities Act. The legal costs don't just fall on the HOA as an entity. If a court finds gross negligence, board members can be personally liable for damages. That means their homes, their savings, everything they own could be on the line. I called my attorney, a former JAG officer named Rachel, and laid it all out. She didn't even hesitate. We file a federal civil rights complaint. We go after the HOA as an organization and the board members individually. That'll shake the fence-sitters off her side real fast. 2 days later, the papers were filed. Copies were delivered to every board member. I made sure mine was delivered at 7:30 in the morning, right as the neighborhood's early walkers were out and about. Nothing like a uniform process server handing you a thick envelope on your front porch to get the gossip mill running. By noon, my phone was blowing up with calls from board members suddenly wanting to talk. Step 2, control the narrative. The HOA had been whispering to neighbors about how aggressive I was, how I'd overreacted. So I decided to take my story public not with a rant, but with facts. I called up a reporter I knew from the local news station. We sat down for an interview in my living room, Sarah by my side. She told them in her calm, steady voice exactly what happened the day Karen cut the power, how the machine shut off, how she felt her chest tighten, panic rising, how she could barely breathe when I found her. The segment aired that night. Footage rolled of the Black Hawk's landing, of paramedics rushing into our house. They even played Karen's own words from someone's phone recording. "Not my problem. Should have followed the rules." By the next morning, the HOA's public image was in free fall. Neighbors who'd been neutral started calling for Karen's resignation and some for the entire board to step down. Step 3, bring in reinforcements. I reached out to a disability rights advocacy group I'd worked with before. They agreed to send a legal observer to the next HOA meeting, along with a couple of volunteers who specialized in community organizing. Their goal, educate residents on their rights and show them they didn't have to be afraid of the board's intimidation tactics. When Thursday night rolled around, the clubhouse was packed not with Karen's supporters, but with angry neighbors who'd seen the news, read the complaint, and realized the HOA had put them all at risk. Greg, the acting president, tried to start the meeting, but people weren't having it. One man stood up and shouted, "My brother's in a wheelchair. What if it had been him she targeted?" Another woman waved a copy of the ADA and demanded to know why the board thought they could override federal law. I sat in the back, letting it unfold. This wasn't my fight anymore, not directly. This was the community turning on them. Finally, when Greg tried to gavel the room quiet, I stood. This ends one of two ways. I said, either the board votes to remove Karen permanently and issues a written apology to my family, or we take this all the way to federal court. And if we go to court, you won't just lose, you'll lose your homes, your savings, and whatever shred of credibility you have left. Silence. Then, a voice from the board table. I moved to remove Karen Holt as president, effective immediately. It was seconded before Greg could even open his mouth. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. They thought that would be enough to make me back down, but I wasn't finished. Next, I said, I want a public commitment that no HOA rule will ever be enforced in a way that endangers a resident's health or violates federal disability protections. Put it in writing, vote on it tonight, and distribute it to every household. Greg looked like he'd swallowed a lemon, but he nodded. The motion passed. Walking out of that meeting, I could feel the shift. Karen had been the HOA's shield and spear. Without her, the rest of the board was exposed, scrambling to save themselves. Sarah met me at the door when I got home. Is it over? She asked. Not yet, I said. There's still the matter of making sure she pays for what she did, because step 4 was coming, and it was going to be the knockout punch. 2 weeks after Karen was voted out, I got the call I'd been waiting for. It was Lieutenant Harris, her voice carrying the kind of satisfaction you don't often hear from a cop. Mark, thought you'd like to know the DA's office just filed additional charges. Federal prosecutors are coming in. Karen's looking at felony reckless endangerment, interference with medical equipment, and ADA violations. And with the video evidence, her lawyer's already hinting at a plea deal. I thanked her and hung up, feeling that slow, heavy satisfaction settle in. But I didn't want a quiet courtroom deal to be the end. I wanted the community, the very people Karen used to lord over, to see her accountability play out in daylight. The opportunity came faster than I expected. The HOA had to hold a public meeting to announce the leadership change and address the ongoing litigation. And because Karen's removal was a direct result of her own actions, the bylaws required her to be present for the transition of records in person. That's how. On a bright Saturday morning, Karen found herself walking into the clubhouse, flanked by her attorney, facing a room packed shoulder to shoulder with residents. She tried to keep her chin up, but the whispers were relentless. That's her. She almost killed his wife. She's the reason the news trucks were here. Greg opened the meeting with the usual formalities, but the tension in the air was thick. Per HOA bylaws, he said, we are here to finalize the transfer of leadership and address the resolutions passed at our last meeting. Before Karen could say a word, a woman from the second row stood up. I have a question. Who's paying for the legal defense? Because I'll be damned if 1 cent of my dues goes to cover her mess. The room erupted in agreement. Greg stammered something about insurance coverage, but another neighbor cut in. Insurance doesn't cover willful criminal acts. She's on her own. Karen's face flushed red. This is a witch hunt. I was enforcing the rules. She jabbed a finger toward me, brought in helicopters to humiliate me. I stood slowly, letting the murmurs die down. No, Karen, I brought in helicopters to save my wife's life. You humiliated yourself when you decided your personal taste mattered more than federal law. I walked forward, holding up a folder. And since you're so fond of rules, here's one you might appreciate under federal civil rights statutes. You are personally liable for damages when your actions target someone with a disability. That means this, I tapped the folder, is the lawsuit you'll be answering for in court, not the HOA. You, gasps, phones recording, Karen's attorney whispered urgently in her ear. But I wasn't done. I've also filed for a lien on your property. I continued, to ensure you can't sell your house and run before paying the judgment. And since the court already froze your personal bank account pending trial, I'm guessing those wedge sandals are going to have to last you a while. The color drained from her face. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. From the back, Mr. Crawford, the Vietnam vet, called out, "Justice served." The room erupted in applause. Greg, sensing there was no salvaging the moment, quickly pushed through the remaining agenda items. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to remove all Karen-era enforcement policies that had been used to harass residents. They even passed a motion to install a permanent medical exemption clause in the bylaws. But the real show was just outside. As Karen left the clubhouse, a news crew was waiting. One reporter asked, "Ms. Holt, any comment on the felony charges?" Another shouted, "Do you regret cutting the power to a pregnant woman's medical device?" She tried to shove past them, but the cameras caught every second her glare, her silence, her lawyer's hand on her back as they made a beeline for the parking lot. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. Later that week, word spread that she'd put her house up for sale. With the lien in place and her legal bills stacking up, she didn't have a choice. She'd lost her presidency, her reputation, her money, and soon, even her place in the neighborhood she once ruled. Sarah and I watched the moving truck pull away a month later. She stood beside me on the porch, our baby's due date just weeks away. "Feels like the whole place can breathe again," she said. "It's amazing what happens when a storm passes." I replied. Karen was gone. The HOA was declawed, and for the first time since we'd moved in, the neighborhood actually felt like a community. But the best part, knowing she'd never see this street again, except maybe in her nightmares. Karen's departure didn't just change the atmosphere, it changed the people. For months, we'd lived in a place where folks kept their heads down, afraid to speak up against the HOA's queen bee. But once she was gone, you could see it in the way neighbors waved from across the street, the way conversations lingered at mailboxes, the way people started decorating their porches again without fear of a violation notice. Sarah and I settled back into the life we'd hoped for when we first moved here. She was in her 9th month now, moving a little slower but with that glow that made my chest ache with gratitude. The medical equipment stayed hooked up not because she needed it constantly anymore, but because I refused to let anyone dictate what was necessary for my family's safety ever again. A week after Karen's moving truck pulled away, the new HOA president, a retired school principal named Linda Shaw, stopped by with a small pie in hand. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, smiling warmly. "You didn't just protect your wife, you reminded everyone here that we're neighbors, not rivals." I appreciated the gesture, but I waved it off. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I've buried too many friends to stand by while someone's life is put at risk over something petty. Linda's smile dimmed a little, like she understood exactly what I meant. Still, she said, "I think you've given this place a second chance." It was strange, walking the same streets that had felt hostile just weeks before. The same people who used to avoid my eyes now stopped to ask about Sarah, offer to help carry groceries, or just chat about the weather. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is, but it felt like the kind of place we could raise our child in. One Saturday morning, I was out front tinkering with my old Chevy when I saw Mr. Crawford coming down the sidewalk with his slow, steady gait. He stopped, leaned on the fence, and said, "You know, Delaney, I've seen a lot of fights in my time. Most of them, even when you win, you still feel like you lost something. But this one," he let out a small chuckle, "this one feels different. Feels like we got our home back." I nodded. We did. That night, Sarah and I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. The air was warm, the cicadas buzzing in the distance, and for the first time since we moved here, I wasn't looking over my shoulder for the next attack. Karen would still have her day in court. She'd face her charges, pay her fines, and live with the stain on her name for the rest of her life. But for me, the real victory was knowing that when our baby arrived, they'd come into a world where their home was safe, their neighbors were kind, and their parents had proven that standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they think they are, is always worth it. As Sarah rested her head on my shoulder, I thought about the moment it all turned. Not the helicopters, not the courtroom filings, but the split second I decided that her life mattered more than anyone's rules, reputation, or aesthetic standards. That decision made everything else possible. Think she'll ever try to come back? Sarah asked softly. I smiled. Not a chance. She'd have to face all of us, and that's a fight she can't win. The crickets sang, the porch light flickered on, and I realized something. We weren't just residents here anymore. We were part of a community, one that had learned, the hard way, that fear only works until someone stands up and says enough. And as far as I was concerned, if anyone ever tried to pull another Karen stunt in this neighborhood, they'd be met with more than just my voice. They'd hear the thump of Blackhawks in the distance and know their reign was over. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't about following the rules. It's about protecting the people who matter, no matter what it costs. Karen thought she could hide behind a title and bully her way into control. But titles mean nothing when you cross the line into cruelty. In the end, it wasn't just about my wife's safety. It was about making sure no one else in this community would have to face what we did. If you've ever stood up to someone who abused their power, you know the feeling, the mix of fear and resolve, and the satisfaction when justice is finally served. I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, and let's remind each other that no bully is too big to fall. And if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe because we're just getting started.